12 doors. 12 times a woman knocked in the worst blizzard this valley had seen in 30 years. 12 times someone peeked through a frosted window and turned away. She had one door left, and it belonged to a man the whole town feared. What he did next changed 2 lives forever. The wind came down from Copper Fork Ridge like it wanted to tear the mountain in half. Snow fell sideways, stinging like sand, and the sky had turned the color of an old bruise. Clara Whitfield walked into that wind with her coat pulled tight and her boots soaked through. Her wagon lay behind her on its side, one wheel snapped clean off, the horse gone lame in a rut she never saw coming. She had walked 2 miles already. Her hands had stopped feeling cold an hour ago, which frightened her more than the cold itself. She was a nurse. She knew what that meant. Ahead of her, lantern light glowed in the windows of Cedar Hollow. A dozen homes, maybe more, all lit warm and gold against the dark. She counted them like a woman, counting coins she desperately needed. The first door belonged to a rancher named Otis Pratt. She knocked until her knuckles ached. A curtain moved. The porch light went out. She tried the second house. A woman's voice called through the wood. "We don't know you." And the bolt clicked shut. By the 6th door, Clara had stopped expecting kindness and started merely hoping for it. By the 10th, hope had gone quiet too. At the Crow Ranch, the grandest house in the valley, a servant opened the door only wide enough to say that Mr. Crow did not take in strangers, especially not women traveling alone with no husband and no name anyone recognized. The door shut before Clara could answer. 12 doors. 12 refusals. She sat down in the snow because her legs simply stopped working, and for a moment she believed this was where her story ended. On a strange mountain, in a storm nobody would remember by spring. Then she saw one more light, further up the slope, past where the town gave way to pine and rock. A cabin, small and plain, smoke rising steady from its chimney like it had never once gone out. She did not know that the man inside was Elias Boone, the mountain man other families warned their children about, not because he had done anything wrong, but because grief had made him a stranger, even to people who had known him for years. Clara stood up. Her legs found strength she did not know she still had, and she walked toward that last light, because a person freezing to death does not have room left for pride. She knocked once. The door opened before her fist came down a second time. A tall man stood there, lantern raised, beard dusted with frost from stepping half outside already, like something in him had known she was coming before she arrived. His eyes took in her soaked coat, her blue lips, the doctor's bag she still gripped like it mattered more than her own life. He did not ask her name. He did not ask why the town had turned her away. He simply stepped aside and said, "Get in before the door lets more cold in than I can fix." Clara walked into the warmth of Elias Boone's cabin, and neither of their lives would ever look the same again. The heat hit her first, then the smell of pine smoke and old leather, then the sheer stillness of a room that had clearly not heard a woman's voice in a long while. She stood dripping on the wood floor, too exhausted to feel embarrassed about it, watching this stranger move around his own home with quiet, practiced hands. He hung a kettle over the fire without a word. He pulled a second chair close to the hearth, brushing dust off it first, as though company might arrive more often than the room suggested. He did not stare at her the way the men in town had, sizing her up like livestock at auction. He simply treated her like a person who needed warmth, because that was, in fact, all she was. "Name's Elias Boone," he finally said, setting a cup of hot water and dried mint leaves in her shaking hands. Clara Whitfield. Her voice cracked on the second word. Thank you for opening the door. Wasn't much of a decision, Elias said. Man who leaves a person outside in that storm isn't a man at all. Clara wrapped both hands around the warm cup, and for the first time in 12 knocks, allowed herself to believe she might survive the night. Elias built up the fire until it roared, then set a pot of broth over it without being asked twice. Clara sat wrapped in a wool blanket that smelled of cedar and horse leather, shaking so hard she could barely hold the cup he handed her. I'll be gone by morning, she said. I don't want trouble following me into your home. Storm decides when you leave, Elias said. Not you, and not me. She studied him while the fire popped and hissed. The cabin held only what a man needed and nothing more, except for one shelf near the window that seemed cared for in a way the rest of the room was not. A woman's shawl, folded neat, a small carved comb, a photograph turned face down. Clara did not ask about it that first night. Some doors, she understood, opened slower than others. The storm did not let up for 3 days. In that time, Clara learned that Elias split his own wood, mended his own boots, and spoke maybe 40 words before noon most days. She also learned he was the only man in the valley who had ridden out during last spring's flood to pull the Turner family's cattle from a rising creek, though nobody in town seemed to remember that kindness, only his silence. Why did you let me in? Clara finally asked on the third night. When 12 others wouldn't. Elias stared into the fire a long moment. Because somebody let me in once, he said, when I had nowhere left to go. Man doesn't forget a thing like that. He did not explain further, and Clara did not push. But she noticed, when he thought she wasn't looking, how his gaze drifted to that photograph on the shelf, and how his jaw tightened like a man holding a weight he'd carried so long, he no longer remembered how heavy it was supposed to feel. On the second night, Clara woke to find Elias sitting by the fire, long after she thought he had gone to sleep, turning that carved comb over in his hands without looking at it, the way a person handles a memory, rather than an object. Can't sleep either? She asked, pulling the blanket around her shoulders as she sat up. Storm's loud, Elias said. Or maybe I'm just not used to another voice in the cabin. Either one keeps a man awake. I can go quiet if it helps. Didn't say it was a bad thing. He set the comb down, finally meeting her eyes. Been a long time since this place felt like anything but a place to wait out the winter. Clara did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing, and the two of them sat by the fire until the wind outside finally softened toward morning. Comfortable in a silence neither one wanted to end. By the time the snow stopped, Clara Whitfield had nowhere else in Cedar Hollow willing to take her in, and Elias Boone, without ever meaning to, had let another person pass the wall he'd built around his heart. Word travels fast in a small valley, and word of a nurse living up at the mountain man's cabin traveled faster than most. Clara did not wait for the town's approval. When Caleb Turner's leg turned septic after a fall from his barn roof, she walked 3 miles through melting snow with her bag of instruments and saved that leg from being cut off. When Abigail Turner's baby came early in breech, Clara's steady hands turned the child in time for both mother and infant to live. Slowly, doors that had been shut to her began to open, not wide, but enough. Martha Hale, the town baker and a widow herself, was the first to invite Clara to sit at her table. You saved my niece's boy, Martha said, setting down a plate of warm bread. Around here, that buys you more than a welcome. It buys you a friend. Not everyone agreed. Silas Crow, who owned more land and cattle than any three families combined, made his opinion known at every town gathering. A woman with no husband, living alone with Boone, he said one Sunday outside the church, loud enough for half the congregation to hear. What decent purpose brings her all this way? Pastor Samuel Reed, a fair man trying to hold a divided town together, chose his words carefully. The purpose I've seen, the pastor said, is a boy who kept his leg and a baby who kept his life. I judge a tree by its fruit, Silas, not by rumors planted before the harvest. Silas said nothing more that day, but the look he gave Clara promised he was not finished. Tommy Hale, Martha's young son, took to following Elias around whenever Clara brought supplies down from the cabin. The boy had lost his own father 2 winters back, and something in Elias's quiet steadiness drew him the way a cold hand reaches toward a fire. "Mr. Boone," Tommy asked one afternoon while helping stack wood, "were you always alone up there?" "Not always," Elias said. "What happened?" Elias set down his axe. "Someday I'll tell you the whole of it, Tommy. Today isn't that day." The boy nodded like he understood, though he did not yet, and the two of them kept stacking wood in a silence that had grown, over the winter, into something like family. Down at the general store, Clara earned her own small victories. She taught 3 young mothers how to bring down a child's fever without bleeding them the old way. A practice she gently explained had done more harm than good in her years of training back east. Old Ben Carter watched her demonstrate the technique on his own granddaughter and grunted his approval, which in Cedar Hollow counted as high praise. "You could have kept walking that night," Ben told her one afternoon, leaning on his cane outside the store. "Storm like that, most folks would have laid down in the snow rather than climb the last stretch to Boone's place. Man's got a fearsome reputation." "Reputation built on what exactly?" Clara asked. Ben considered the question longer than she expected. "Built on grief nobody bothered to understand. Easier to call a quiet man dangerous than to ask why he went quiet in the first place." Clara thought about that answer for the rest of the walk home. Lonely Mountain Man. Spring came slow to Copper Fork Ridge, but it came. One evening, with the last of the snow melting off the cabin roof in steady drips, Elias finally turned that photograph face up and set it where Clara could see it. "Her name was Mary," he said. "We were married 6 years before the fever took her. Coldest winter of my life came the summer after she died, if that makes any sense to you." "It does," Clara said softly. "I stopped going to town much after that. Easier to be alone up here than to sit in a church pew where everyone remembers exactly what I lost." Clara reached across and touched his hand, the first time she had done so without a patient's reason for it. "Grief doesn't mean you have to live like the rest of your life already happened," she said. "Mary sounds like she loved a man worth loving. I don't think she'd want that love to end with her." Elias looked at Clara, then in a way he had not allowed himself to look at anyone in 5 years, not simply seeing her, but truly considering the shape of a future he had long ago decided was not for him. "You've got a way of saying hard things gentle," he said. "Comes with nursing," Clara answered. "You learn people heal faster when the truth is delivered with a little kindness stitched into it." Neither of them said more that night, but something between them had shifted, quiet and certain, as the spring thaw itself, and both of them felt it settle into place. A week later, under a sky full of stars neither of them had bothered to notice in years, Elias walked Clara down to the creek that ran below the cabin, swollen and loud, with melted snow Mary used to say, "This creek sounded like the whole mountain breathing," he said. "It's beautiful," Clara said, and meant the whole valley, not only the water. Elias turned to face her, close enough that the lantern light caught the gray in his eyes. "I haven't felt like a man worth wanting in a long while, Clara. Didn't think I'd feel it again." "You are," she said simply, "worth wanting." He kissed her then, slow and certain. The kind of kiss that asked a question and answered it in the same breath. When they finally parted, Clara laughed softly against his shoulder, and Elias held her like a man who had forgotten, until that exact moment, how warm another person could make a cold mountain feel. They did not rush what came next. Some promises are better kept slow, built one honest evening at a time, and both of them understood that a love worth having was worth the patience it asked for. Trouble rides. In just when Cedar Hollow had begun to soften toward Clara, a rider came up the valley road who made her go pale the moment she saw him from the porch. "Nathan," she whispered. Nathan Whitfield swung down from his horse with the easy confidence men wear. "Believe every door in the world opens for them eventually. Clara, I've traveled a long way to find you." He smiled, the smile she remembered from her old life back east, warm on the surface and hollow underneath. "Your sister told me where you'd gone." "Emily told you," Clara said, and something in her voice went cold in a way the mountain winter never managed. "She was worried about you. So was I." Nathan's eyes moved to Elias, standing silent in the doorway. "I see you found company." "State your business, Whitfield," Elias said, "then be on your way." Nathan's smile did not waver. "My business is with Clara. Family matters. Her father's estate, to be precise, which requires her signature and, I'd think, her good sense in choosing who advises her on it." Clara understood then what Martha had once warned her men like Nathan wanted. Not her heart. Her inheritance, left by a father who had died, believing his daughter would marry well, and marry sensibly. Nathan had courted her for exactly that reason once, and her sister Emily, desperate for his approval and his money, had helped him do it. "I signed nothing when I left," Clara said, "and I'll sign nothing now." "You'll want time to think it over," Nathan said, remounting his horse. "I'll be staying in town a while. Cedar Hollow seems full of hospitable people." He rode off toward Silas Crow's ranch, the one place in the valley that had welcomed him without question, and Clara felt the ground beneath her new life tilt for the first time since the storm. That evening, Clara told Elias the truth she'd never fully shared, that her father's estate carried more debt than value, and that Nathan had once courted her only after learning the property came with land Silas Crow himself had long wanted to buy. "I should have told you sooner," she said. "I didn't want you to think less of me for the mess my family left behind." "Nothing about your family's debts changes who you are," Elias said. "A man judges different things than an estate ledger. Clara judges kindness, judges grit. You've got both in more supply than most folks I've met in this valley, myself included." Clara felt something ease in her chest at those words, not because they solved anything with Nathan, but because, for the first time in years, she did not feel alone in carrying the weight of her own past. Nathan was clever. He did not attack Clara directly. He simply sat in the saloon and the church steps and let Silas Crow do the talking for him. "A woman running from her own family," Silas said to anyone who would listen. "Now we learn there's money involved. And a fiancé she abandoned back east. Makes a man wonder what else she's kept hidden while living alone with Boone. By the end of the week, whispers had turned into open doubt. Even Abigail Turner, whose baby Clara had saved, found herself avoiding Clara's eyes at the market. Old Ben Carter, the town elder, kept his own counsel, but watched everything with the careful patience earned from a long life spent seeing valleys turn on strangers before. "They're saying I used you," Clara told Elias one night, her voice thin with exhaustion. "That I came here running from a scandal. That I only stayed because Nathan wants my father's money, and I need you to protect me from him." "Do you need protecting?" Elias asked. "I need people to believe I'm not the woman they're describing." "I believe you," Elias said. "That's not nothing." "It's not everything either," Clara said, and for the first time since the blizzard, she considered leaving Cedar Hollow. Not because she wanted to, but because she feared her presence had brought Elias nothing but trouble in return for his kindness. Sheriff Jacob Mason, at least, refused to take sides without evidence. When Silas pushed him to run Clara out of the valley, the sheriff answered plainly, "I enforce the law, Silas, not gossip. Show me a crime and I'll act on it. Until then, the lady stays where she pleases." Even Martha, ever loyal, found herself defending Clara so often that her bread deliveries came with a running joke attached. "I've started charging Silas Crow double for his biscuits," Martha told Clara with a wink. "On account of all the extra breath." Waste correcting his gossip. "Man ought to pay a tax for it." Clara managed to laugh despite everything, grateful that at least one door in Cedar Hollow had never once wavered. That night, Clara packed her bag and stood at the cabin door, ready to spare Elias the weight of a fight that was never his to carry. Elias caught her hand before she reached the latch. "Running proves them right," he said. "Staying proves them wrong." "Which one sounds more like you?" Clara set the bag down. The fire. The fire started in Silas Crow's barn on a dry, windy night, sparked from an overturned lantern nobody could later explain. Flames climbed the old timber fast, and within minutes the barn had become a wall of orange light visible from every ranch in the valley. Somebody screamed that Tommy Hale was inside. He had been sent to fetch tools for his mother and gotten trapped when the loft ladder collapsed behind him. Ranch hands stood frozen at the heat. Silas himself, for all his pride, could not force his legs toward that door. Elias ran straight through the flames without a second's hesitation. Inside, smoke had filled the loft, and Tommy had curled into the corner, coughing, too frightened to move. Elias found him by sound, alone, wrapped the boy in his own coat, and carried him back through a wall of fire that had already begun to collapse the roof behind them. They came out together, both of them burned and coughing, and the whole town watched Elias Boone, the man they had once feared and misjudged, fall to his knees in the dirt with Tommy safe in his arms. Clara reached them first. She tore Elias's sleeve away to check the burn along his arm, her hands steady, even though her heart was not. "Stay with me," she said, the old fear in her voice finally breaking through the professional calm. "Elias, stay with me." "Not going anywhere," he managed, though his voice was rough with smoke. "Somebody's got to finish stacking that wood with Tommy." Even half-conscious, he made the boy laugh through his tears. Martha Hale wept over her son, and Silas Crow stood at the edge of the crowd, staring at the man he had spent months trying to discredit, unable to find a single word to say. The town that had closed 12 doors on Clara Whitfield now stood in the ashes of Silas Crow's barn, watching the mountain man they had misjudged carry a child out of the fire, and not one of them looked away. Dr. Hollis, the closest physician, was 3 hours out on another call, so it fell to Clara to treat both burns through the night, boiling clean water and grinding herbs by lantern light while half the town crowded the porch outside, waiting for news. Sheriff Jacob Mason kept them calm, reminding everyone that shouting through a sick room door helped nobody heal faster. Around midnight, Tommy woke first, coughing, but breathing clear, and Martha's sobbing turned from fear to relief so suddenly that Pastor Reed had to steady her by the shoulders. An hour later, Elias's fever broke, and Clara finally allowed herself to sit down, her hands trembling now that there was nothing left to hold steady for. "You saved them both," Pastor Reed told her quietly. The boy, and the man everyone in this valley had already given up on understanding. "I only stitched what fear tore open," Clara said. "The running into the fire, that part was all him." By sunrise, half of Cedar Hollow had come to see for themselves that Elias Boone was recovering, and more than a few of them stayed to help Martha rebuild what the fire had taken, without anyone needing to ask twice. The letter. Elias recovered slow, his arm wrapped and aching, Clara at his side through every long night. It was during that recovery, while cleaning out an old trunk Clara had found beneath his bed, that they discovered a letter Mary had written in the last weeks of her illness, sealed and never opened. Elias's hands shook as he broke the wax. "My dearest Elias," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then I am gone, and you are alone in that cabin doing exactly what I fear you'll do, which is nothing at all. Grieve me, but do not bury yourself beside me. I loved you enough to want you to love again. Find someone who makes the mountain feel less like a mountain and more like a home. That is my last wish for you, and I mean to be stubborn about it, even from wherever I end up." Elias read it twice, then set it down and looked at Clara with an expression she had never seen on him before. Something between grief finally loosened and hope finally allowed. "She knew," he said. "Even then she knew I'd need someone to tell me it was allowed." "She sounds like she loved you well," Clara said, her own eyes wet. "She'd have liked you," Elias said. "Stubborn women tend to recognize each other." Clara laughed despite the tears, and Elias reached for her hand, no longer a man holding a 5-year-old weight alone, but one finally setting it down where it belonged, in memory, not in the doorway of every future he might still have. Justice. With Elias healing and the whole valley humbled by what they had witnessed, the truth about Nathan Whitfield finally came out. Sheriff Jacob Mason, digging into Nathan's claims about the estate, found letters proving Nathan had forged documents to make it look as a Clara owed her father's creditors a debt that did not exist, a debt only her signature and her inheritance could settle. Clara's sister Emily, riddled with guilt, rode all the way from the east to confess her part in it before the sheriff even asked. "I wanted his approval," Emily admitted to Clara, tears streaming freely. "I was foolish and scared of being alone, and I let him convince me it wouldn't hurt you. I was wrong, Clara. I am so sorry." Clara, who understood better than most what fear could make a person do, forgave her sister, though she made clear that trust would need rebuilding, one honest day at a time. Nathan was run out of the valley by Sheriff Mason before nightfall, his scheme exposed to every family who had once given him a place at their table. Silas Crow, humbled by the fire and by his own barn rebuilt with lumber, Elias quietly donated without being asked, finally found the words he had owed Clara for months. "I judged you before I knew you," Silas said, standing awkward and stiff at the cabin door. I was wrong, and prouder than I had any right to be. I'm sorry, Miss Whitfield. Apology accepted, Mr. Crow, Clara said. Though I'd ask you remember this the next time a stranger knocks on your door in a storm. Silas nodded, and for the first time since Clara had arrived in Cedar Hollow, he meant what he said next. I intend to. Caleb Turner, still favoring the leg Clara had saved the previous winter, stopped Silas on his way out of town that same week. Funny thing about judging strangers too quick, Caleb said, leaning on his cane. Tends to make a man look foolish once the truth catches up to the gossip. Silas had no clever answer for that, and for once, he did not try to find one. Emily Whitfield stayed in Cedar Hollow through the summer, working alongside Martha at the bakery to repay a debt no money could settle, and slowly, one loaf and one honest conversation at a time, she and Clara found their way back to being sisters, instead of strangers who shared a surname. 20 winters later, Elias and Clara married that same summer. In a small ceremony, Pastor Samuel Reed performed beneath the pines outside the cabin, with Martha's bread on every table, and Tommy standing proud beside Elias, as though he had claimed the role of son long before anyone made it official. 20 winters passed after that day, and the lonely cabin on Copper Fork Ridge became the busiest home in the valley, full of children, then grandchildren, then neighbors who no longer needed convincing to knock on that door. Clara opened a small clinic in town, the first Cedar Hollow had ever had, and trained 2 young women from families who once would not have let her cross their porch. Tommy Hale grew tall and steady, working the land beside Elias, until he had a ranch of his own, and he named his first daughter Mary, after the woman whose letter had once given 2 lonely people permission to try again. Martha never remarried, content instead to be grandmother to half the valley's children, Clara and Elias's included. Silas Crow, humbled for good, became one of the clinic's most generous supporters, though he never did stop grumbling about the cost of Martha's biscuits. Sheriff Jacob Mason kept the peace for another decade before handing his badge to a younger man, and Pastor Reed preached at more weddings in that valley than any minister before him, though none, he liked to say, ever moved him quite like the one beneath the pines. Every winter, when the first heavy snow settled over Cedar Hollow, Elias gathered his family by the fire and told the same story, the one about a woman who knocked on 12 doors during the worst storm the valley had ever seen, and the one door that opened. He always ended it the same way. Everyone else closed their doors, he'd say, taking Clara's hand the way he had that very first night. And I thank God every day that I didn't. The valley learned, slowly and sometimes painfully, that kindness offered to a stranger costs a person very little, and that fear dressed up as caution can shut a door on someone who only needed a moment's warmth to change the whole shape of their life. Clara's courage taught them that a person's worth is proven in what they do for others, not in the rumors spoken about them by people too proud to look closer. And Elias, a man the valley once feared for his silence, taught them that grief does not have to be a life sentence, only a season, if a person is brave enough to let spring back in. If this story warmed you the way that fire warmed Clara on the worst night of her life, subscribe to see how the rest of this family's story unfolds, and comment where you're watching from. I would love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story has traveled together.